All right.
Good lunch.
Yeah, very good lunch.
So they know their audience. Beef stew and then crumble.
Not hang back on those portion sizes.
No, the crumble was massive.
God.
She told me I said just a bit of custard as well. She told me off not having enough custard. So,
Right. What are we on now? Code update and carbon auditing. Right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for returning so promptly. We'll start the afternoon session, if we may, please. I hope you've all enjoyed your lunch, and that doesn't make you feel too soporific for the afternoon. So we've two sessions this afternoon. We're starting in the first session with a code update from Rebecca. As long as, yeah, you finished your lunch, Rebecca, I hope. So we've got a code update from Rebecca, and then Richard is talking to us on the subject of carbon auditing. So Rebecca, over to you, please.
Many thanks, Andrew. I will just pull up my slides now. Okay, so while you're digesting your lunch, in the next half an hour or so, I'm going to run you through the Electronic Communications Code. I'm going to start with a recap of what the code is, and then the sort of main bulk of the presentation will be looking at some case decisions from tribunal with some important messages in them, which I'll be highlighting before very quickly looking at what's more to come on the code. And you may have heard Andrew describe it as the gift that keeps on giving. And certainly, if you like an intellectual challenge, I think it would be fair to say it's a very generous gift. All right, then. So a reminder, then, what is the code? Well, the Communications Act 2003 still exists, but it was amended with a new version of the Electronic Communications Code inserted in Schedule 3A, which came into force back end of 2017, and which I will keep referring to as the code for simple purposes rather than Electronic Communications Code. Now, just to sort of remind everyone really that the Communications Act itself does provide for a telecoms operator or an internet provider to hypothetically acquire land through CPO powers, and that's in Schedule 4. However, a code agreement and the imposition of a code agreement is not CPO. There are similarities with CPO. You can sort of see some echoes of CPO, if you like, in the code, potentially. And there is an element of compulsion, but it's important to note that it's not CPO. And the code is essentially a code right, and code rights include the ability for an operator to deploy their equipment, to maintain, upgrade, and share their apparatus. And that equipment can be telecommunications equipment like the mast that you can see on the screen, or it could be sort of buried or services such as a fibre optic cable running underneath land, or indeed overflying someone's land. Before you sort of jump into negotiations, it's worth taking a step back and just doing some very initial checks, really. And the first one of those checks is just to be clear on who is it that's seeking the agreement. So who are the operator? Now, the key question here is, are they a code operator? And therefore, by definition, do they have code rights? This is very easy to check. You can do it via Ofcom's website. The reason why I raise this is that there's been a few queries recently from members where a non-code operator has written to site providers, clients that you potentially will be acting for, and I think it would be fair to say that they masquerade as if they were a code operator. So the content of that correspondence will mention that rents under the Electronic Communications Code have reduced, and therefore they're offering an awful lot less for a site. But obviously, if they're not a code operator, they don't have code rights, and therefore the deal will be much more of a contractual, a consensual sort of negotiation and a commercial one, rather than being influenced directly by the code. The other important thing, just to be clear on, is just to understand what statute or indeed what part of the code applies. And you've broadly got 3 scenarios. On the right-hand side there, you've got a new mast site or a new apparatus site. It may not be for a mast, but a new site for new apparatus. And that falls very easily within the Electronic Communications Code. If it's an existing site, you've got one of 2 scenarios, and that will depend on whether it's in a protected agreement or whether it's contracted out. And for those that are not familiar with the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, it's very easy to check. Essentially, you would flick through the agreement and you're looking for a clause that will say that sections 24 to 28 of the 1954 Act have been excluded. Those are the security of tenure provisions. If it says that, then it will be a contracted out agreement, so the middle column. If it doesn't, then it's what would be simply called a protected agreement with security of tenure under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. So, and this is important to know, both in terms of the procedure that an operator should be following, but also for the assessment of consideration, and indeed other terms may well be relevant. So just setting that kind of scene then, really, in terms of making sure you know which statute and what you're dealing with, which is, let's have a quick look at the renewal of protected leases. So those are the ones where they have the security of tenure under the 1954 Act. So the procedure at the moment, as we understand it, is that the 54 Act procedure should be followed. And that's quite different and distinct from anything that you might find in the code. So the operator should serve what's called a Section 26 notice on the landlord or the site provider, as they're often called in the code, to seek a renewal of the existing agreement. And those have sort of set timescales. That notice has to be a minimum of 6 months up to a maximum of 12 months and ending on a term date. So if they're outside of that, then essentially the Section 26 notice is invalid, and you can ask the operator to essentially go away and start again. Being at 1954 Act, any disputes falls to the county court to decide, whereas under the code it's the upper tribunal or the first tier tribunal. And the key case in this matter is Ashlock. Now, that's been heard again. There's an appeal of that being heard at the Supreme Court. It was heard in early February, and we're awaiting a decision on that. And as soon as that is available, there'll be a web note published. But certainly that's our understanding as we understand it at the moment. Sticking with existing agreements then, quite often something that you see in a lot of cases, and indeed something that comes up a lot in member queries, is how relevant are the existing terms of the agreement? Just to have a little look at what the different statutes say, under the 1954 Act for a protected lease, Section 35 states that when it comes to a renewal, if one party is proposing a change to the agreement, then they've got to demonstrate why this is necessary. This is often referred to as the OMA principle, a case for OMA. Similarly, although slightly different, but under the code, paragraph 34.12 of the code must have regard to the terms of the existing code agreement. So you would be forgiven for thinking that there is weight to the existing terms, and to a certain extent there are, but it's not as clear cut as that. Very simply, the court's views, this is the tribunal and the county court here, they consider that the terms of an existing agreement are relevant, but only where they are not at odds with rights that an operator would ordinarily have under the code. So, for example, and you'll hear me talk about the Pippingford case quite a bit throughout the rest of this presentation, because it was quite a key case. In Pippingford, the court looked at the rent variation clause. Now, the existing protected lease had a rent variation clause for RPI variation, and as we all know, RPI at the moment is very healthily going up. In terms of rent variation clause, you'll see some significant increases. Now, understandably, the operator didn't really like the RPI clause and would have much preferred CPI, which is running at a lower level. But the court held that there was simply no justification for that change, and therefore the new lease should have the same RPI variation clause as the existing lease had as a term. However, other rights which can have historically been of value and have seen sort of additional rents or consideration paid, such as rights for an operator to upgrade their equipment or to share their mast with another operator, those are specific code rights. And because there are specific code rights in themselves, the court's view is that the operator doesn't need to justify the need for them. They're in the code, and therefore they should be allowed in any new agreement. So if an existing agreement prohibited the sharing or upgrading, unfortunately, that's not likely to follow through into a new agreement. And indeed, additionally, it's very unlikely, I've not seen one yet, that your client's going to be able to charge any additional rent for rights to share or upgrade. There's some cases down there at the bottom. All of these cases have web notes on our website, so you can go and have a look and read if you want more information. All right then, looking to liability and compensation, whilst these two are sort of discreetly different, they do overlap, so I'll deal with them together. Generally speaking, what operators are proposing in the terms that they offer is that the third party or the site provider will only be given indemnity for third party losses only. Therefore, essentially, any losses or damage that the site provider themselves incur are not automatically covered. It's just third-party losses. What the operators will say sometimes is that paragraph 25 of the code provides for some statutory compensation for damage and loss. And that as a statement is factually correct. There is a paragraph 25 and it does provide for statutory compensation. However, and this is a very important however, that compensation is only available where the tribunal imposes an agreement. So, in a scenario where it's a 1954 Act renewal that may even go to county court, or it may just be uncontested and go through, or indeed where a deal is reached, a consensual deal is reached between the parties, that access to paragraph 24 isn't there. There is no statutory compensation. So if compensation or liability is important, and that will depend on your client and it will depend on the specifics of the site in question, then that will need to be written in as a contractual right to compensation or a suitable liability clause. And operators will routinely resist these, but if it's important and there's a real risk or issue there, you may well be advising your client to potentially go to tribunal purely to get the rights of statutory compensation. And yeah, we've seen plenty of cases where the court's view is not to impose any terms over and above that of third-party liability, and indeed not to write in effectively paragraph 25 compensation where there wouldn't normally have been been that right. And again, there's some recent cases there. So, and just to sort of kind of highlight some of the issues here, again, it was highlighted in Pippingford, but you can see it in others as well. The court's view in Pippingford was that the compensation and the rent payable is ultimately rooted in market evidence. Because the market evidence suggested that deals were done consensually without there being a contractual compensation clause, they took it that there was no need to impose one in this particular case. And you'll see there on the sort of highlighted section that the decision says that they see nothing unfair in it. And that if there is any unfairness, it's as a consequence of the decisions that are made by Parliament when it enacted the code. And obviously, they kind of go on there to say that if in future contractual compensations are incorporated into agreements, then maybe future decisions will change, and it will be necessary to revisit this particular issue. So essentially, what you have is that any rent that's agreed, it needs to reflect all risks, including risks of any liability or compensation issues that may arise. And I suppose there the question is how many people or how many site providers and people acting for them have really understood the new world of the code and really understood the sort of restriction on that access to compensation when agreeing the rent. Turning to the tricky and sort of slightly difficult issue of rent then itself, the actual consideration and how you go about determining it. So there's been a whole plethora of cases, but the early cases, when the code was introduced back in 2017, understandably, there was no transactional evidence in order to make decisions. So a structured approach was taken. Slightly artificial way of trying to determine consideration and indeed compensation that's payable. Coming back to Pippingford again, and this is fairly key here, this is the first case here where the courts now consider that there's enough evidence available in the market and they have a preference to use any transactional evidence over this sort of artificial structured approach. There's some cases where a structured approach has been taken. For those of you that sort of act in this area, you'll be familiar with many of them. The last one there on the slide, the Affinity Water or Allenby Road case, although that was heard around the same time as Pippingford, and although the decision sort of stated a preference for using transactional evidence, because both parties had agreed a structured approach, the tribunal could literally only use the evidence that was put before them. So they kind of were stuck. They'd gone down that path, so they kind of got stuck with having to review the evidence on that basis. But they again restated their preference for transactional evidence now. And as I've mentioned, Pippingford is really the first one of those. One thing that Pippingford did flush out, which is of use and to many site providers, is this issue around premiums. This is something which operators have been trying to disguise, and they've labelled them early completion incentive payments, or ECIPs for short. Now, Pippingford is the first case really where the court became aware of these premiums that were being paid, and they were typically seen as around £15,000 lump sum up front, with a reduced annual consideration therefore payable thereafter. And they ordered their disclosure of these premiums, these ECIPs. The operators weren't probably very happy about this because they wanted to keep them hidden. But the court basically said that whilst they're called ECIPs, those labels are purely window dressing, and in actual fact that they're evidence that they are an established feature of the market, and they represent a core component of the financial package. And yeah, so you can see there that the courts weren't persuaded by the description of incentive payments, and indeed they commented that actually often they're paid irrespective of the timing of when an agreement is completed. So they essentially said they were nonsense, and they were clearly influencing site providers' behaviour. So in Pibbingford, the amount that was decided was reached at 3,000, and that was made up of an initial rent of 1,200, which, for those of you familiar with this area, sounds an awful lot like Dale Park, but actually the transactional evidence that was presented suggested around £1,200 per annum as the base rent. But then the court then added to that the equivalent of an ESIP, but because they weren't able to award it as a capital sum, they instead divided it by the number of years. It was a 10-year term, and allowed it a 5% yield to reflect the fact that the site provider wasn't receiving it up front, to get to £3,000 per annum. And then on top of that, they added £500 per annum for professional fees. And I should say on this particular site, whilst it was a rural site, it wasn't your typical farm. The mast was in woodland and surrounding rural estate, which was used for what's been described as hostile environment training. So this is where members of the military were sort of practicing skills of taking people hostage and things like that. So the disruption of a telecoms operator, haphazardly wandering through a site to get to a mast was significantly more disruptive to the business operations in this scenario than perhaps they would be in some others. The other thing which the court said is that when looking at the transaction evidence, they favoured new mast transactions, so new mast sites, as opposed to evidence of renewals, essentially saying that, in the assessment of rent under the 1954 Act between a willing buyer and a willing seller would be on a vacant possession basis. The site should be assumed to be vacant, and actually new mast sites were preferable for that reason. But also, even in a lease renewal scenario, both parties would ultimately be aware of the code in the background and an operator's ultimate recourse to the code at some point in the future. And therefore, the court saw it that actually they would be indirectly influenced in those negotiations in any event by the code. And yes, sorry, that's the point I've just made. The difficulty that any of those acting in this area will have is that the evidence is largely in the hands of the operators, who quite frequently with ESIPs, with these premiums, will make them subject to non-disclosure agreements. However, there is a solution which we propose, and we know that some of our members have been using already. We would suggest that you seek full disclosure from the operators of transactions, and specifically ask for full details of any premiums as per the Pibbingford decision, and state your reliance on the information that you've been provided when writing up your recommendations and in any correspondence between yourself and an operator. The other thing that you can do, which we've signposting people to in the last couple of weeks, is of course share comparable transaction information between yourselves. You can use the CAAV notice board for this purpose, and a web note went up actually at the weekend encouraging people for that very purpose. Please do go on there, and as well as posting questions asking for comparable transactions, if you have a look and see if you can help any other fellows, that would be very much appreciated. On the point of making an assessment of consideration, the last point on this slide here is just to encourage you not to be too creative in your approach to the difficulty with the code and some of the transactions being not necessarily always truly comparable, and the complexities that exist. Might encourage you to sort of take alternative approaches to valuation. There's a word of warning here from the M&S case. This was actually a mast site that was on top of a retail building in Edinburgh, if I remember rightly. And one of the parties had valued the rooftop as if it was a zoned retail area. That was one of their approaches. Clearly that didn't wash. It's very difficult to justify a rooftop having the same value, perhaps, as a shop floor. And another attempt was to value it as if it was a viewing platform for sort of tourists to come and view the surrounding landscape. Again, there was really no evidence for this, as well as practicalities with site security and access to the rooftop, which would have made it impractical anyway. And you'll sort of see there from the quote from the case that actually, unfortunately, because of his approach on the valuation, it discoloured the judgment regarding some of his other evidence. So just be careful. If you do find yourself having to represent either an operator or site provider, the tribunals and courts are taking a bit of a dim view in terms of the excessive nature of some of the representations that are being made, and that's influencing their decisions when it comes to awarding costs. So in the St Martin's case, you'll see here on the quote that they're suggesting that usually the issues are quite narrow and they don't require extensive evidence. They do not require complicated statements of case which obscure the issues or elaborate bundles of documents. And they basically indicate here that they should be capable of being conducted with a relatively restricted budget proportionate to the matters in issues in hand. So there's an indication there that actually they took a bit of a dim view of the approach by both parties, sending in vast bundles of documents and seemingly overcomplicating the issues. Again, on this point, and slightly sarcastically in Marks and Spencer's, they say that they pay testament to the ability of the legal profession to make formidable arguments on both sides. But you'll see there in the second part of that statement that it would be preferable in future cases if they were to restrict themselves. So again, they took a dim view of this maximum approach to litigation. And you'll see this really following through in the practice type directions from the tribunal. The highlighted sections there suggest that it's particularly important for code cases. The tribunals under strict time limits, and that the parties should seek to narrow their differences. And again, you'll see this reference to matters being in a concise statement. The tribunals really don't want excessive documents. They want it nice and straightforward, highlighting what the issues are at hand. So there's no need to kind of quote lots of cases or authorities, because that's ultimately where they come in. And in terms of actual evidence, the general rule is that you should limit the transactions to 10. There might be justification in some situations, but generally the guidance is a maximum of 10. So that's a run through of some recent tribunal decisions. Then a look into the future, because the story doesn't stop there. And today, as it says on the slide, is only a snapshot. It's very high level. We're just scraping the tip of some of the cases that have been decided. I think there's about 20 or 30 cases lined up for tribunal as we speak in the next coming 5 or 6 weeks. In terms of important decisions, we're awaiting 3 key ones from the Supreme Court now. Ashlock, which links back to that point on 1954 Act renewals, Queen's Oak and Compton Beecham, the last one being around who can confer code rights and who is the occupier. And then on top of all that, as if that wasn't enough, with things beginning to settle down from a case law perspective, the government has put together a proposed code reform with the bill that's currently working its way through Parliament. It's the second part of that bill, the telecommunications infrastructure bill. It should say actually on there, it should say product security and telecommunications infrastructure bill. we're watching that one with interest. As it's currently drafted, it's encouraging the use of alternative dispute resolution. The key thing to note there is that is only to encourage it. It's not being mandated. Also suggested is that operators have some complaints handling procedure. Now, they will be required by statute to have a complaints handling procedure, but we wait to see the detail on this. It will be subject to further consultation, from what we understand, with Ofcom being involved, as well as the operators. And we've also asked to feed into this because we'd like to see some teeth to it to make sure that it actually holds some weight. Probably the most controversial part of the bill is the valuation principles for 1954 Act renewals. Essentially, what's being proposed is that the valuation principles of the code, paragraph 24, will simply be lifted and inserted into the 1954 Act for code-related agreements. Another minor change which makes sharing of apparatus as a distinct code right, which really tidies up something which was missing before and has been the subject of a lot of case law. Once we have the decisions from the Supreme Court on those 3 cases, we've got a planned webinar later this year. So if you are interested in working in the code or would like a reminder and an update, please do keep an eye out for that webinar later in this year. And just finally, just to say that we are in contact with DCMS regarding their proposed bill, and indeed some voluntary working groups, which has a host of operators and other stakeholders on it, looking at several areas. So we are active in this area, and I'm more than happy to take any questions after Richard. Thank you.
Rebecca, thank you very much for that useful update. I'm sure there'll be questions that will follow, but before we do that, can we please move on, Richard, to receive your paper on the issue of carbon auditing.
Okay, thank you very much. Continuing a theme from my earlier presentation, measurement again, and looking at measurement, perhaps a different natural capital and ecosystem service flow. This time, growing interest in reducing emissions in the agricultural sector and in the land management sector more broadly. Political issue with lots of commentary, but I'll try not to get into too much of that today, but look at the measurements and the principles of carbon accounting. The common mantra gets repeated all the time: you can't manage what you don't measure, and so we need to be measuring. For the purposes of this presentation, carbon accounts for all emissions from agriculture and farm business and those sorts of things converted into carbon equivalents, etc. But that's what we're talking about here. So a brief run through of carbon auditing, and then looking at some of the markets that are emerging or are already in place and what values might be available. First key question, as with anything that we want to measure, why do we want to measure it? We could be doing it for our own sustainability. A client might want to reduce their emissions, measure and manage their carbon because it's a good thing to do. That might be open and shut, clear case. They might want to see carbon as a resource. Better resource management can lead to better profit. Arguably, what is farming other than moving carbon from air to soil to plant, perhaps into livestock, and then into the market and then back around again. Better resource management, better profitability, better efficiencies, and all those sorts of internal business considerations. There's also external considerations as well, market participation here. Is there an engagement there with purchasers? There's the sort of there's those net zero potatoes that now you can buy in Waitrose. There's various marketing benefits to net zero as well. Market for carbon offsets, which we'll have a look at later, but also a market for carbon insets, and that's where you're tackling it within the supply chain so that those purchasing Morrison's dairy producers, as many people as you could like to name, so that they can then show to their customers and they get those marketing benefits of having a low carbon or a net zero supply chain. There's also regulatory pressure perhaps coming through. It's a hot public issue. Is there going to be a regulatory baseline that getting ahead of it now is an advantage? Important when in the market and looking at regulations that we are focused on measuring what the market wants and how it wants it to be measured. Much easier with biodiversity net gain. They told you how to measure it. With carbon, there's a slightly larger challenge. There are certain ways in which the Woodland Carbon Code, you need to measure how the Woodland Carbon Code wants you to measure it. We'll look at this later. But a bit of forethought here can avoid a bit of duplication of measurement. There's no point in doing one measurement if the, let's say the government subsidy for low carbon efficiency requires you to prove it to another metric. You're just going to be doubling your work. Whatever we're doing, there's a need for confidence and comparability and interoperability, which is a word that comes up in the literature. So we can compare across measurements, activities, actions, and all those sorts of things. The current requirements and methods for carbon auditing flow down from high-level policy, from international agreements, international legislation, and then into standards that have been drawn up by state and market. Looking at this background quickly, there's various international agreements that the UK is committed to, and then that feeds into UK legislation. Net zero by 2050, as set out in the Climate Change Act 2008. And then the devolved administrations legislate for their pathways under that overarching framework. Climate Change Act Scotland 2009, subsequently amended in 2019 to get to net zero by 2045, with more scope for land use change there. The Environment Wales Act 2016, and then the bill that's been passing through the Northern Ireland, in Northern Ireland recently, and some of you may be aware of the sort of wrangling over definition of what's an emission and what isn't an emission. Are agricultural emissions is a question that's going on over there. How do you account for methane, separate targets, and all the politics of this really brought out in the debate around that one, so quite interesting. But it's now been passed, been settled, the debate there, and should be coming in, should be receiving royal assent soon. Under those requirements then, there's state and market standards that come up. So in the UK, there's just a couple of standards there. There's some international standards. And then there's these sort of market initiatives, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Vera Carbon Standard, and the Gold Standard. And some of you may have heard these names, be familiar with these names. And a lot of those were early initiatives that have then subsequently fed in to how the methodology works and has been adopted more broadly. And looking at that methodology and adoption, broadly two things here. Again, very broad brush looking at this level. First, we should be considering which emissions are in scope of the assessment. We've figured out that we want to measure, we know why we want to measure, then we should be looking at what are we going to measure, what's in scope. Scope 1 are the direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So perhaps farm machinery, emissions from farm machinery there. Scope 2, indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, let's say. So what's the carbon cost of generating the electricity that you then use to light the buildings, the farm buildings. And then Scope 3 is all other indirect emissions that occur within a company's value chain. Much harder to get a handle on Scope 3 emissions because you could be requiring data from what's outside of your control. What's within your control is probably going to be covered by Scope 1 and 2, and so then where are you going to get that data from Scope 3? Some might be available, some might not be available. Mostly, carbon audits will be undertaken to a Scope 2 level, but with varies, and depending on what people need them for, they'll operate with a different target. Once what's in scope has been settled, then we need to think about how complex are we going to be with our measurement, and that's the tiers coming down from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, from their methodological complexity, as I put it there. Tier 1, national or international factors readily available, published by the IPCC often, or real broad brush, high level facts and figures. Tier 2, intermediate level of complexity with some locally specific data. Woodland carbon code calculations are often considered in this. Those, what carbon are we sequestering within a tree? Those calculations are done off yield tables and averages and these things, but they're slightly more local. And then we're getting into tier 3, and that's very complex specific data. So maybe we've done our woodland carbon code calculation at tier 2, and then we're running a full LiDAR scan with soil sampling and to really calculate the biomass of the woodland down to an individual tree level. That's a tier 3 calculation. For those who are interested, there's they might have heard of it, and I will probably pronounce it incorrectly now, the Bunloyd estate in Scotland, one of the estates that's been purchased for natural capital purposes. They've done a full assessment, biodiversity as well as carbon, of their estate there. And they work through this process where they've done woodland carbon code calculations. They've done more general peatland calculations, but then they've gone into tier 3 as well. But again, high level of need, very motivated, very interested owner, and perhaps quite expensive, quite resource intense. So that's the high-level methodology. And thinking about practicalities then when we get to the farm. The examples then of the data at the top of this slide. Inputs, the 3 Fs, fuel, fertilizer, feed, energy use, distribution, waste, livestock, soil sequestration, so some negative there, balancing things out perhaps, impact of current land management, and impact of land management changes, such as transitioning to no-till, doing some afforestation, and those sorts of considerations. So, we can think about what sort of data, looking at those tiers and scopes, what sort of data are we going to need to be building up, and what's the evidence base here? Given the complexity of this, as you can imagine, there's various market initiatives and government initiatives to put some tools in place. I won't mention them by name, not to plug any of them or otherwise, or to recommend one of them or the other. Broadly suggested that the mainstream market tools are very similar. Usual sort of data collection and then some calculations, and then it generates a report. Some of you will be familiar with them. Some of you might not have seen them. Some are free, some are paid, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, and then this again comes down to that consideration. Great to have the tools. If we're operating in the market, what does it want us to measure? And importantly, how does it want us to measure? A good example is those government initiatives in Scotland, the Beef Efficiency Scheme and the Farming Advisory Service. There was some funding available for carbon auditing, but they required you to use AgriCalc was the tool that they required you to do. So there's no point in using the Farm Carbon Toolkit because they'll need you to do an AgriCalc calculation. Wales offers some general advice through Farming Connect. Northern Ireland, they're proposing soil testing and LiDAR. They want to establish a carbon baseline. Unclear the practicalities of this yet. And then in England, there's no government directed programme. Janet Hughes, who's in charge of DEFRA's, some of DEFRA's future farming policy development. She was responding on the Farming Forum, and she said there are a wide range of carbon calculators in the market, and we're not at the stage planning to provide one through SFI. And so there doesn't seem to be a move here for a government tool, as with biodiversity net gain, for carbon. Although I have heard mention of a DEFRA and AHDB developed tool, but I haven't seen much other than the news announcements that it is going to be developed. But again, and I keep coming back to this, what are we measuring and how do they want us to measure it? So that's measurement, very briefly and quickly run across. And now getting into the codes. Some of you will be familiar with the Woodland Carbon Code, might have dealt with it and agreements under it already. There's also the Peatland Code and other developing codes as well. A code is essentially an established protocol for measuring and verifying carbon sequestration or emissions avoided in the case of the Peatland Code. An interesting question and perhaps a slightly sort of a question that overlaps with the politics and the commentary on this is why trees and peat as the focus. One of the primary reasons is that they're measurable. You can go out on site and you can put a tape measure, a piece of string around a tree. Soil carbon, for example, is much more challenging to go from organic matter to carbon content to change over time and specifics and those sorts of things. Much more challenging to measure soil carbon content. And also, these seem to be the key interventions for impacting emissions directly. That's not to say that storage isn't important, but sequestration or preventing emissions is what's primarily interested in if we're looking at tipping that balance sheet. The labels probably aren't legible from that distance. This is from a Natural England paper on the sequestration effects of land use changes or land use in general. Bars to the left represent sequestration, bars to the right represent emissions. And could I have a pointer? 30-year mixed broadleaf woodland is second from the top, so high-level sequestration. Peatland are down here, so degraded peatland pumping out a lot of emissions. And then the soils are in the middle here. So lots of storage, but not necessarily achieving that sequestration that is needed, or at least intended to be achieved. Quite a bit of familiarity with the Woodland Carbon Code. We've published some notes on this, and there's good guidance available online, so I'll just run through it very quickly. It's government-led, initially developed by the Forestry Commission, and it's now owned in the language by Scottish Forestry, conforms to one of those British standards. Credits can be used for reporting. Important to distinguish between the compliance markets of the UK emissions trading scheme, which trades at high values. High energy use companies must operate within that market, but these offsets that we're talking about, that's for voluntary markets. Companies can make claims, verified claims about their carbon position and their emissions position. Woodland Carbon Code measures the carbon sequestered in trees planted and entered into the code following the standards. The peatland code is slightly different in that it relates to emissions avoided. 80% of the UK's peatlands are in a degraded state, estimated to be up to 23 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, and that's 3.5 of the UK annual greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking that agriculture is 9 or 10, depending on where you look, that's a significant additional impact. And then the peatland code assesses the emissions avoided by restoring that peatland and making it hold on to the carbon, supported by the government, again, but led by a coalition of interested parties, third sector funded. Currently, again, voluntary offsetting, not under the compliance scheme. And then thinking about the credits generated, projects once registered generate pending issuance units, essentially a promissory note calculated on the projected sequestration of the project. They can be sold, but they can only be used for offsetting once once the project has been verified. So once it's been verified that the trees have grown and the units have been generated. So there's less value there. They can only be used in the future, so companies need to plan their offsetting accordingly, and there's the risk of failure of delivery, that the units won't come through. Woodland carbon units, verified carbon stored in woodland, can be accounted for as an offset, and then once they're used, they're retired and they can't be double used there. Peatland units, again, it's emissions avoided, again, voluntary offsetting, and can be retired from the registry. All of that's registered in the UK Land Carbon Registry. That's where you can go to check which projects are, to see what's available, and reportedly a rather clunky registry currently, but they're working on making it more user-friendly and to make trading more efficient. Thinking about values with a quick example here, woodland carbon code units sell for between £7 and £20 a tonne. PI, pending issuance units, are on the lower end of that. You get more value for providing things like access. Companies often like to do a bit of marketing, a bit of team building. Here is us planting a tree that we use to offset our emissions, and they will pay more for that. Then things such as Carbon Plus, what they call Carbon Plus, is if you're planting high quality biodiversity woodland, let's say, then people might pay a little bit more for that so that they can say that they're sequestering in good quality projects. So that's how they tip up towards that £20, but still not trading at a very high level necessarily. They're supported through the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme, essentially an underwriting by the government, a promise that they will pay or they will buy carbon credits at a fixed price, a reverse auction process. The last round of that traded at £18.62 per tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. They are just opening the next round of that as well. So if anyone is interested in that, then do have a look on the website. If you Google Woodland Carbon Guarantee, then it'll come up. And I'll repeat what Flossie said earlier about reverse auctions. It's been noted that people are not very good at accounting for their own costs when entering into reverse auctions. They are perhaps overly competitive and therefore reduce their own return and the returns of other people. So preparation for reverse auctions is very important, and not to lose sight of the reason why they're going into it and the profitability. So looking at that example then, 1 hectare of 82-year-old oak, the estimated sequestration across the lifetime is a total of 105.1 tonnes of carbon. At £20 a tonne, that's £2,102. £25 per 61 per year, which is just over £10 an acre a year. So this comes back to a theme from earlier. Those carbon values within the market are perhaps not overly significant necessarily, but again, right terms, right price, there might be bespoke deals to be made at a better value. Plenty of speculation about future price of offsetting credits. I'm not going to guess and join in with that, but I will raise one, I just want to mention one point quickly, and that's, the theory of carbon credits is they're an exercise in transition. They're to offset emissions as we move to a net zero economy by 2050. So at that point, the idea goes is that all the carbon has come out of the economy, and if all the carbon has come out of the economy, then there's no call on carbon credits. And so therefore, maybe there are some really hard emissions that, there are some bespoke deals to be done. But in theory, carbon credits are then not worth anything because there aren't any emissions to offset. Question about whether that's achievable practically, and also political questions. If we haven't met net zero by 2050, what's the sort of topic of conversation? What are we interested in? Question earlier about food security. If suddenly food security becomes more important politically, and there's less of a pressure to reduce emissions from the public and from policymakers, that takes off value potentially from carbon offsetting and carbon sequestration. So there's something interesting to watch there. They're not necessarily just going to go up in value as people try to reduce their emissions. And then a quick mention of developing codes. The Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund has been sort of helping the development of these, UK government scheme. Interest in project development from private bodies as well, and also third sector organisations. Some that you may be familiar with, Soil Carbon Code, touched on earlier the challenges of permanence, reversibility, monitoring. Trade-offs here as well, increasing carbon sequestration in soils can result in more nitrous oxide emissions, a more potent greenhouse gas. And so there are questions there about balances and net emissions as well, and capacity as well. What's the capacity within UK soils to sequester significant amounts of carbon? Hedgerow Carbon Code, Salt Marsh Carbon Code, the Wilder Carbon Standard for rewilding project, and there's various blue carbon codes as well for marine projects as well. And then the market, we've talked about credits, but going beyond credits, there was an example, Jeremy gave the example of commercial forestry earlier, competitive business in and of its own with agriculture as well, looking at that future low carbon supply chain. And offsetting often isn't possible because of additionality. They're commercially viable on their own, and so they fail that additionality test that they need carbon finance in order to get them off the ground. And so then there's an argument there that they can't actually generate credits and enter into these markets. And if they do, maybe the trees are locked in for a long time and they can't then fell them. And so that low carbon supply chain is the place of value. Value for farmers in accessing supply agreements, talked about Morrison's, dairy supply. Who's going to be looking for a low carbon supply chain? What will they pay for it? Insetting. Development of renewable generation and storage schemes as well. Need for land to address emissions internally, driving higher values. So that's large companies, corporates, looking to offset their own emissions through their own schemes through land purchases. So there's a commercial opportunity here as well. And then habitat banking to bring it back round to biodiversity net gain. How can we create a habitat and sell multiple ecosystem services? Stacking and bundling, a repetition from my slide earlier. Again, nutrients, carbon, biodiversity, recreation, value-added products. You know, what's the best source of funding? Is it possible to stack and balance these things? More questions than answers there necessarily. A repetition of my additionality slide to really bring that home is that, you know, you must be considering that our projects are delivering additional carbon sequestration. Otherwise, without that additionality, it actually devalues the value of the credit, because it can be accused of greenwashing, or companies are less willing to pay for them. And so again, a reminder of the complexity and the need for clear and direct advice. And I hope I'm doing all right for time. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Richard. Another new language to learn. We've done it once or twice already in the last 20, 30 years, but new subject area, new opportunities, and thank you for talking us through that, Richard. Rebecca is back with us. So before we break for tea, do we have any questions for either Rebecca or Richard on the subject matter that we've just listened to? One at the front, please.
Adrian Thorntonberry. I'm quite heavily involved in peatland. I also sit on the Yorkshire Dales National Park Management Plan Forum, and we were presented with the most up-to-date carbon calculator based on the North Pennines. Very interesting. We are losing £4.3 billion worth of carbon from the Yorkshire Dales itself, not the whole North Pennines. And the expert, who apparently is a leader in the field of doing these calculations, quote, said, "I'm concerned about the auditability of the data we're using and the assumptions, but which is very scary when you're coming up with such a big number, and that's driving policy, when they don't actually know that the assessments, and both George and I know that their assessments by Natural England are actually not worth the paper they're written on."
Thank you. Yeah, a challenge definitely in assessment and carbon, and often what comes into the practical assessments is related to reasonably unsettled scientific theory in the background as well. And like you're mentioning, then it brings into question those measurements and all those sorts of things. And yeah, a known challenge that everyone's looked at. Peatland is a good one. Woodland, they seems to be slightly better, but still questions over as well. And it's a big challenge for the soil carbon code, in particular, soil carbon being challenging to assess. And what it does, it essentially is hold down values of credits as well, because we can't be certain that, you know, you can see 5 kilos of lamb, you can see a lamb's leg and you can measure it, but in the same way, it's much harder to get a grasp on what you've got when you're trying to measure and account for and sell and trade carbon that's hard to pin down. So yeah, a noted issue.
Anybody else? No, you've shocked them all into submission. Right, in which case we'll probably all need a cup of tea, and we'll come back for the last session. So could we do that as quickly as we can, please, and then we can be back in for the last session in about 20 minutes, which should hopefully see us finish a little earlier. Very good, thank you everybody.
Good.
Well done.
Good sessions. Good sessions.
Yeah, yeah.
It was interesting on the questions. Chat to that.
She's here. She's not presenting again. Right. The national park, yeah. Yeah, No, Flossie. Suggest it to her. Hello. I can. I think we got most of the. We got most of them back last week. Not all of them. Some of the ones that skip off early. We can't. This is the way it is. Yeah. No, we'll do badges. We'll do badges.
timing. 3:35. 3:35. Have I got to? Oh, so we just run through. Yes, I just run through to 4:20, basically, or thereabouts-ish.
Yeah.
That keeps it moderately
So,
simple.
yeah, 50 minutes you were down for, aren't you? No.
Well, it's what time you, in a sense, it's what time you want, given that we got the opportunity to start a bit.
Yeah. Well, you comfortably got.
Well, I mean,
45.
the slides aren't enormously straining, as I remember it.
Well, you were originally scheduled for both, for 3:35, for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
So, if that gets us to sometime after 4 o'clock, then...
Well, sometime, 45 minutes gets us through to about 4:10.
Yeah.
So sometime 4:10, 4:15.
Yeah, something like that. That's good.
That's dangerous. Ooh, well, they all seem happy.
Yeah, feedback's good. Right, good afternoon, people, good people.
And
Quick-
others.
Yeah, and Martin Swan. He's ignoring me. Thank you very much. Suitably refreshed and revitalised. And into session 4. So as if you hadn't had enough to absorb in terms of information, our last session takes us through an agricultural tenancy update from Jeremy, to advice from Jeremy on the Chancellor's spring statement earlier today, along with a general taxation update, and then we will round the day off with Rebecca's third session with us, where she will be giving us an update on residential tenancies. So, Jeremy, over to you, please, for your update on tenancies and tax. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much. I think the thing to do, really, is to start with the Chancellor's spring statement. He confronts you with a rather difficult conundrum. Do you wait here till 6:01 and join the queue at Sainsbury's for the petrol? Or do you just go through Sainsbury's because it's the nearest cheap station you've already got? Or indeed, you might have enough fuel, of course, to get home. No, we have, he is... I just hope you had it plugged in while you were here. He has come forward with a package of measures. The spring statement was never expected to be anything very much more than an overview of things, but of course, as yet has been his fate as Chancellor to be landed with one more thing after another. And he's had the cost of living prospects to deal with and the political pressure on him over that. He's concerned, I think, the debt payment, the interest payment on debt servicing now is at 83 billion a year, I think he said at one point in it. Growth reduced because of the effects of the Ukraine war, and just general sensitivity, you know, how much more is out there to come and rattle the cage. So he's looking at that. He's looking to lay out a tax plan to cover things. Well, you know, we'll see what that actually amounts to and so on. There's a document there. The package of measures that he's come forward with today have no particular theme, I think, to them, other than simply responding to the pressures that he's under immediately as they appear at this point, rather than stepping back and a larger picture. So in that sense, it's a set of political reactions, probably more than it is, if you like, the considered package that he, I think, quite desperately wants to come forward with. So what we have is, just to round out my starting point, what we have is a view that we have 5p off fuel allowance, fuel duty rather, for a year. So it's a temporary cut, which would then revert at the end of next March. And it is from, as I implied, 6 p.m. this evening. So the conundrum is there for you. The big spectacular moves, if you like, that will attract interest and maybe a headline or two are around national insurance. Very often, of course, national insurance has been the forgotten tax. It raises, frankly, for many lower paid employees, they pay more between them and what the employer has to pay on them in national insurance than they pay in income tax. Yet everybody argues about income tax, and national insurance gets away with it. Classically, it's been Labour governments that have raised national insurance, which is bizarre because it's effectively a tax on employment. But we have seen what is to become the health and social care levy. That has been affirmed as in place and with no change to the 1.25% on the employer, on the employee, and on the self-employed as of this April. What he has then done, and it has been shadowed over the last handful of days, is what he has then done is increased the threshold for national insurance, so that threshold, which was at is at the moment 9,500, is due to go as of the beginning of April to 9,880, is as of July, and again I'm waiting to see quite this absolutely spelt out, but this is as I understand it, as of July then goes to the income tax threshold of 12,570. It's then said that it is intended that those two thresholds remain aligned. Somewhere out there, at any point over the last 40 years, there's been a conversation about why aren't income tax and national insurance just merged. They do have slightly different tax bases, they do have some different rules that frankly don't matter at all to most people. The real headline when this was looked at in the early and mid-80s was that nobody would stand the increased rate of income tax that would be the natural result of that. The reality would be improved, the show would look worse. And that's the position that we're in. But they are now nearer alignment than they have been in practice, or at least where they will be by the time you get to July, than they have ever been. And that's an interesting outcome from this. Employers in the room may be relieved to see that the employer's allowance, having been raised previously from 3,000 to 4,000, now goes to 5,000. And so that is an easing, if you like, of cash flow at the beginning of the year. Again, nothing monumental, but it's a help in the right direction and so on, arguably just reinforcing what might in tax design terms be a faint complication. The third major area of change, and again you can argue about how much is actually in it and what it does, but this can be presented as one of the opportunities that come from no longer being subject to the European Court of Justice, that Her Majesty's government lost a case over the 5% VAT rate some time ago on energy-saving materials. So far as they've been able to do that, that has become hedged with conditions around the social beneficiaries and fractions of business and frankly all the pain. What he has now done is as of the 1st of April until the 31st of March 2027, so 5 years, is declared a zero rate on energy-saving materials, which, as I understand it, from looking at government summaries, and again, just waiting to see the full details, will cover you on solar panels, will cover you on roof insulation and presumably other insulations, it will cover you on heat pumps, it will cover you on wind and water turbines. So to that extent, there is a cash reduction in the investment the government will be liking homeowners to make. Obviously, businesses could just simply recover the VAT, but that is his third area, and presumably a little bit of a down payment. For those of you, so as we shall be in a fortnight's time, just over in Northern Ireland, that, of course, Northern Ireland, thanks to the protocol, is still within the regime, the single market regime for goods, and that reduction and simplification on energy-saving materials will not apply in the province, but an equivalent cash sum will be made available to the Northern Ireland Executive if we can find one. So there are other bits and pieces in there, and some more around national insurance and so on and so forth, but and bits around social security support. But that's the nub of what he's done for today, all basically with effect from next month. The interesting stuff, and I referred earlier this morning to his recent MICE lecture, and the MICE lecture is a long-standing economics lecture that the chancellors get asked to give, where they talk in larger and more visionary terms, heaven help us, about the universe. But this was where he laid out his notion of looking to use tax design to actually deal with some of the fundamental problems of the British economy around productivity. How do we crack our shortfall in business investment? How do we crack our shortfall in innovation and research, private research and development? How do we crack our shortfall in adult skills? And he is carrying on with those themes. I think we're, again, still waiting to see quite how they gel, but they're good themes and it's a worthy goal. And what he appears to have done is with a view to the autumn budget, and right the way through the statement this lunchtime, he was going through, look, the big stuff's for the autumn. Autumn's when we do tax. Autumn's all the big stuff. And here I'm just dealing with what I've got to deal with now and give you a view on the economy. And it's a bit hairier than I'd have liked, but not quite as hairy as I could have feared. And he is laying out there what appears to be a completely open discussion about capital allowances. Because next March, the annual investment allowance that most of our client base, or indeed most practices here, would have available for their investment. And if we're looking at robotics and robotic milking, or we're looking at new combines, or whatever it is, this is quite significant. Then that is due to drop, unless he does something, it's due to drop from 1 million to 200,000, because that's the default level. Those of you acting as companies or for companies will be aware of the super deduction at 130% that will fall away when the corporation tax rates go up next spring. And he's saying, well, what actually are we going to do after that? We need a tax regime that stimulates the investment from private businesses that we need to drive the economy forward. And the way it's expressed in the full documentation for the spring statement looks like a pretty open discussion, which after some of the arguments that we've had over the super deduction, and I've had meetings with the Treasury and so on this and looking at it, actually looked like the opportunity for an open conversation with the government about what might genuinely make things work. He's saying, well, look, do we just go for a default level of £500,000 on the annual investment allowance? So anything you spend up to that just gets written off against tax in that year. Do you just go for full expensing irrespective? Write it off in the year you spend it. That does encourage some people to go off and buy glossy new toys, but no, as we've seen in the past. But nonetheless, do we increase writing down allowances? He'd also opened something that I think is meat for us to look at, the structures and buildings allowance, where at 3% for our buildings, I think it's neither a fair nor a stimulant. It's something that wasn't there for a few years, but actually, agricultural buildings, a lot of them don't really have a functional life of 33 years on average. So, I think that is the interesting thing. We have our own Valuation Compensation Tax Committee, as Andrew knows, coming up in just next week. And those are the sort of things I'd be wanting to have them look at and take a chatter over. So he's dealing with the here and now, tacking his ship in the winds of the current storms, but looking ahead, he's trying to do a bit more. But of course, we're watching the sands of time for the hourglass of this government now beginning to drain away. A government elected with a probable next election date of May 24, and that everything that's cut across, from the pandemic, the supply chain crisis, the war, all this is cut across any conventional electoral cycle. And how this actually works on and gets through, I don't know. But I have seen in some ministers' statements and meetings I've been in with agriculture ministers, where you get the sense that if it's not done by 24, it might then not be done. And this is, you begin to hear the pressure of time on their shoulders at this point. I think just watch for that. But he's going to try and do something. Anyway, we'll come back to tax a little later and various thoughts on that, but it seemed best just to cover off the spring statement first while fresh to mind. Oh yes, and the last point is, it is probably more show than anything else, but more for the enthusiasm of the day, is that looking at 2024, he has nailed his colours to the mast of a reduction in the basic rate of income tax to 19%, so a penny off. That will serve directly in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The Scots have got it sorted out themselves, but we've given some money to do it because of the nature of the way income tax is devolved to Scotland. So let's go and talk about some tenancies and other agreements while we're at it. Well, again, in the way of the world evolving, we won't get to the first slide quite yet, because what I did just want to draw your attention to, thinking about the non-agricultural tenancies you may have on some farms, and particularly estates, or indeed some of your own tenancies maybe. We have today, Parliament, the Commons, are discussing the Lord's amendments to the coronavirus commercial rents bill. So it's now in its dying stages. There's no chance of it being changed with anything new. We are where we are with it, and it's something you should just be aware of, lest it cross your horizon. And what this says is that there are businesses, notoriously, of course, in hospitality and elsewhere, that were shut down because of the pandemic measures during the lockdown periods. They were tenants. They had a liability to pay rent. Some of them paid it, some of them didn't. Where they didn't, and there's a continuing argument, there is of course a liability, and the government is putting in place with this bill a structure for those liabilities to be resolved. And it's a structure that says that there will be a limited time period in which one party or the other can take the matter unilaterally to arbitration. So in that sense, it sounds terribly familiar. It's just that we in agricultural tenancies have a particular structure that allows that. Here, this is people within their own free agreements now being told that this is where they're going to go and get it done. And the arbitrator there has got a rather interesting job of determining on the basis of what the poor people in front of him actually put, which is going to be an interesting challenge, to determine whether this prejudices, whether paying the rent prejudices the viability of the tenant, and if it does, how far the landlord's solvency is prejudiced. So there's a bit of an accounting exercise. It's going to depend, as with all arbitrations, quite formidably on the extent to which the parties are capable of producing evidence that answers the questions they're being set by law. And I can see, from experience elsewhere, that quite a lot of them will simply sit down and say why they can't pay and don't want to pay and leave it at that. The guidance that's coming out with the legislation will point people to things they should include in their arguments, but we wait to see what people actually do. But if you are acting for somebody in such a case, then do look at that guidance and think about the sorts of tests that you've got to demonstrate, and then just think where you go. Arguably, it's a structure which actually encourages people to come to a settlement rather than go right through to arbitration. But until we've tested it, we don't know. It comes with quite a lot of challenges, and it's not quite arbitration as we know it. This is being done by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, not the world's leading arbitrators. So, let's actually look at this slide. I spent the morning talking about economic change. And we're going to see new activities, and we're going to see a lot of pressures on people, and that's going to take a lot of sorting out. And we're going to have people looking at just trying to do farming better, and things that they can do with farming to reinforce their businesses, and indeed in some cases actions that replace farming. And we have a spectrum across the landlord-tenant sector of tenants who are simply there just on a short-term, let's just say a short-term FBT. They're taking it because they're tenant farmers, they want to rent land, whether owner or occupier or tenant, and it's there for the commercial purposes of farming. And that's in their mind, and all the rest of this stuff is broadly by the by in most cases. We have longer-term tenants who are there. They're probably on AHAs. They could be on a long-term FBT. They expect to be there in a decade or two's time. There may be a succession still to come. And they as much see themselves in the light of their status relative to an owner-occupier in terms of the day-to-day economics of life as they do that, but as they do the immediate short-term issues. They don't want to see themselves disadvantaged. And how they then come through this is one of the challenges in all of this. At the very bottom end of this spectrum, we have, of course, where land falls vacant. And that's where some of the new schemes coming along may very well be alternative markets for land that would otherwise have been let. And again, that's purely a choice for the owner at that stage. But at the other end, we're looking at what a long-term tenant might want, but how does that balance with the owner's interests? Where are we on the effect on the reversion? Where are we on the viability of the farm in these changing and difficult times? And very often, I think it's fair to say, most people's ambitions are rather less than the other party might fear. And I alluded earlier on to this morning to the fear that some landlords may have that the tenant really wants to cover the land with trees, where all the tenant wants to do is probably just screen the new slurry store. But it is looking at how we balance these things. Mostly we are looking at people here who are tenant farmers because they are farmers by identity and tenants by their status, and actually not looking to do too much that is not farming. Again, people can over-dramatize some of these things, but it comes back to a fundamental plea in today's circumstances, which is that the parties should be talking. With everything that's just happened in the last month, never minding uncertainty and never minding lack of evidence and the rest of it, you could, to an extent, having just received an application for the President to appoint two arbitrators in rent reviews, you might nonetheless feel that a rent review is something you might just like to put down the road for a while until you think of how you're going to argue it one way or the other. But if that's your view, landlord and tenant should still be talking. The rent review is an occasion for an awful lot of other conversation to go on. And if you don't have the rent review, and we saw this 15 years and more ago, after BSE, during foot and mouth, and through those years when rent reviews didn't happen, and quite a lot of people fell out of the habit of talking to each other at all. And as a nation, we are terribly, terribly good at not having conversations. And we each know what the other would answer the question we wouldn't dare to put to them. So they don't know they've been asked, they don't know they said no, and so on. So change is going to need to be looked at in many situations. And quite often, this is about simply supporting income, and so rent. Because I come back to looking at one of the prime drivers in this being supply chain pressure. What the supply chain will want from many businesses may actually then drive what needs to be done on the farm in order to pay the rent, in order to support the farm business. So this isn't about people necessarily just seizing on a scheme or having a fancy idea or having something too radical that they should really go down and lie quietly for a while. This is actually something that the supply chain requires. So thinking about how that flows through. And so the theme in landlord-tenant discussion that comes through and catching up on all of this, and that really we've covered. Again, coming back to a theme I could have run this morning, but here I'll do it this afternoon. Just to pick up on a conversation over tea. We are very much in the foothills of these new markets. Nobody really understands too much about them from practical experience. Risks are still to be bottomed out, gaining a sense of perspective in all of this. But the easy and obvious analogy, easily within many people's memory, is where we were at the beginning of the last decade with feed-in tariffs. And if you like, the skill, the template, and it's probably a lesser template than the scale of what we now have, but the template is there, with the reaction as members who in 2009 knew next to nothing about on-farm renewable energy, and by 2011 were skilled, proficient professionals in the entire subject. It hit Cornwall almost immediately in April with the introduction of feed-in tariffs. Second-hand Peugeot salesmen were running around Cornwall selling solar panels. And clearly some Cornishmen bought them. And there must be farms somewhere down in Cornwall, probably on the south side of the peninsula, where somebody now has extended seller's remorse for having done a deal in late April or May 2010, a deal he was terribly pleased with at the time, at £200 an acre for a solar farm, because that felt like better money than he knew before. And then values rose and rose and rose, and we learnt about perspective and one thing and another, and we are more or less in that stage. People are playing with things they don't understand. They don't actually know what's about to blow up in their face. They don't know the measures they think are terribly precautionary may actually be the ones that do themselves most damage. And that's where, we'll see in a moment, measures perhaps can be taken, what I've called here the risks of acting ignorantly. We have a little exchange with DEFRA, where when we talk through some of this, and I say, well, there's an awful lot of ignorant fumbling going on, and they look terribly shocked and aghast and say, no, we mean nascent markets. But I alluded here to the issue of the tenant who sells carbon. Well, he's got himself a liability. Somewhere out there is the counterparty to the contract who's going to want that carbon delivered because that counterparty is relying, dependent, contractually expecting that carbon to be available for his business. So let's look at all of this. And then on the other side, I've seen people try to draft in tenancy agreements. We'll reserve all the carbon. Well, what actually does that mean? This atom in that molecule in that tree. Are you going to take it out? Or are you going to let me take out all the other molecules that aren't or the other atoms that aren't carbon? But actually, it either means nothing or it means everything. And some poor judge is going to get stuck looking at this. But a tenant is managing carbon. Carbon is the cycle that moves from soil to plant to animal and back again. If he can't deal with that, what's he doing? What's he paying rent for? Why should he pay rent? So, step back, and we're just looking for a certain element of sense in all of this. And again, natural capital tells a story. It's an analogy. Again, we see people wanting to reserve all natural capital. Well, go ask a court what that means. It comes out of academic environmental economic literature. If you go read the Levelling Up paper, you can find natural capital, social capital, human capital, institutional capital. And the bank manager won't want any of them. But it means reality. It means go back to where I was this morning, look behind the labels at the facts. We're looking at soils, we're looking at boundaries, we're looking at trees, we're looking at watercourses or whatever it is, and start playing with that. But the last thing we mostly want to do, unless we want to do it deliberately, is restrict economic activity. Economic activity pays the rent. The rent's the return on the landlord's capital. That keeps the world going round. So it's looking at these things and just trying to see through it. And so we have our model FBT. It's adapted over time. We, 3-4 years ago, started putting in some fairly basic soils clauses in it. Nothing too fancy, but sensing that the mood in the market is moving that way. There should be some soils clauses. The centre of gravity has gone that way. We parked our tanks on the centre of gravity. We cannot draft, despite our best endeavours ahead of any reform of the CAP, we cannot draft to what we don't know. And so what we've actually done, in one of the central pieces of the FBT as revised last year, is to have a no surprises clause in it. Because we're looking at lettings now, this Lady Day, this September, when we don't know what half these schemes will look like. We don't know where private markets will go. Richard talking about biodiversity gain. Well, if that's around in any of this, it's not around till late next year. So what we're saying there at this point, and we may revise, we may well revise it in a couple of years' time when we know more about some things. But what we say there is neither party will unilaterally, on a letting made this year, alienate carbon. Neither party will enter a conservation covenant unilaterally. This is no surprises, so business can continue. When they know enough, when there's a sensible commercial deal to be done, then they can do it. Up to that point, they're more likely to make fools of themselves and along the way annoy each other intensely, which is not, again, productive. We've allowed for people to include a farm objectives plan. And I have picked up from one or two people around that that's been taken rather seriously, that because we say they might, they think they have to. And that may be something that we have to look at, and I'm looking at Julie, chairman of our property committee, on the front row, and thinking that maybe that's something that we look at again. It's not intended to be prescriptive, it's intended to be assistive and optional, but we can look at that. In the user clause, we have said, yes, it's agricultural clauses only, but looking ahead, particularly with SFI in mind, and now since we put this in, we know more about SFI, consent not to be unreasonably refused for a financial assistance scheme, but look then again at the terms on which reasonable refusal could be in mind, a landlord's tax status, for example, and wherever you might be. Or indeed, just simply something fundamental in altered to the reversion. Now, it's one thing for the tenant to deal with everything that SFI wants on soils. It's another thing for him to turn the farm into a bog, unless the bog earns you an awful lot of money. But in looking at the FBT, let's look at the templates, because templates, it's offered merely as that. And we do get criticism for people who just use a template because it comes off the shelf. Now, to pick a case where no member was involved, it was simply the prospective tenant who did this. Having worked out that what he wanted to do was probably a tenancy, he said, well, I got one of these from somewhere else. It's not really very relevant, but it's an agreement. We could do that. Because it's treated like a talisman. They just hold it up and somehow it'll keep the vampires away. No, this should be tailored. Think about what you want the agreement to be. Think about the business deal. Think about what happens. The real acid test in this is, how do you want this agreement to end? Where there's investment, what's to happen to it? What condition is the land to be returned in? What are you expecting? Because then you can work back from there and it starts driving structures of argument. Clients, going back to that particular prospective tenant, clients want to see, okay, we've got to have it, so we pay the least possible, so there's the least amount of work in it, which is absolutely wonderful for them, till it goes wrong. Then, of course, that's the point when they feel the need of an insurance policy. But underneath all this is that there's a business deal, it has a logic, find the right structure, and then draft the agreement. Where are we on new schemes at the moment? Well, for SFI, and that's all we know about at the moment, DEFRA is not asking for landlords' consent on the form. DEFRA is looking at the tenant in the eye and saying, well, you're an adult, you run a business, somebody's let you out with a checkbook, on a good day you're probably allowed a box of matches. If there's anything that's going on in SFI that you need to talk to your landlord about, go look at your agreement, go talk to your landlord. That's your lookout, not ours. Actually, of course, in SFI, there's not a lot of room for a tenant to have trouble with a box of matches at this point. SFI pilot woodlands? Arguably, but not much else. We don't know where we're going when we come to local nature recovery or landscape recovery. I mean, landscape recovery is going to be a 20-year scheme, at least, and involve private money. It's going to be pretty seriously contractual, so I suspect everybody's going to be looking at everything very hard. And the ways and means for trying to bring tenanted land into that, and how far tenants want to be in that with the scale of possible habitat change. This is all still for the future. And aspects of local nature recovery, some of that could look like mid-tier and higher tier countryside stewardship. Some of it could look really rather more serious in terms of change in the reversion. So it may well lie outside some of these fields anyway. And of course, we're coming back to people who are farmers by identity. You know, temperamentally, mostly, they're unlikely to want to go down too far down many of these roads because it's not who they are. But we'll see how those get tackled as we go through. But we're looking at a lot more than schemes, and I think this is where we tend to get the eye distracted by talk about people being distracted by carbon this morning, but distracted by schemes. We've got people who want to run businesses, people who are going to lose basic payment progressively over most of the years of this decade, and they're looking at what they want to do with their businesses. And some of this may be looking at the new private environmental markets that are coming along. We discussed the issue of not enough value in carbon, that you need it anyway. But we're looking at all the mechanics that need doing about, well, how do we make this farm an income-generating, profit-earning operation that pays for the family that's there, that does the investment, that looks after the retirement funding, and is a return on capital, assisting generational change. And that's a fairly powerful exercise, and the lump sum may be a feature of some of that for some people. But it's the commercial management of change. We're coming back to the real stuff of life in business at this point. And so we come back, of course, to the theme of today, which is slurry stores. You all came across from the north of England just to talk about slurry stores. And I've talked and Floss's talked and so forth, and just looking through all of this. But at this point, I think where I want to tease you is looking ahead, just playing through some of these things. I talked a little bit about funding in the morning, we'll come back to this. But DEFRA's capital, without, I think, breaching too many confidences, DEFRA's capital schemes like you to be around for 5 years after this comes on stream. So you're sitting there, this is all right for AHA. AHAs normally get a buy on this sort of caper. But you're sitting there with 4 years left of your FBT. It may only have been a 5-year FBT to start with. And you're running a perfectly viable, perfectly proper, very sensible dairy business or other business producing lots of slurry. And you really, really need a store. And you don't want to walk away from the business. This is a good business and it's paying rent and looking after you and you enjoy it. So what you've probably got to go and talk to the landlord about is, can I have an FBT that gives me the security long enough for me to fund the half of the slurry store that DEFRA won't fund? Because otherwise, how's it going to happen? If DEFRA look at this and say, well, you've only got 4 years left, it's going to take you 2 years to get planning permission. So working through this, and again, it may need some trees around it along the way, just to deal with the ammonia and the like. So consent at that point. What are the terms in landlord and tenant on which this slurry store goes in? Tenants improvement. How are you going to look at that as an exercise in value? And funding. Classically, of course, this is where the historic model, whether it's land drainage or some of these major things, the grant would go in and the rest would get split 50-50 between landlord and tenant. There will be situations, and I alluded this morning, where neither landlord nor tenant even wants to put that much money up. I'm going to retire in 3 years' time. Frankly, this business doesn't stand the cost, even if I'm going to be here. Well, again, I came back to a point that actually at that point you might like to have talked about the lump sum scheme earlier. So please don't get the questions in the wrong order. But we're looking at funding, and we have for 86 Act tenants these two recourses. We've got Section 11, so I'm running a dairy farm, I need a slurry store, it's required for the system of farming. Great. Can we get the landlord to pay, get the tribunal, get the landlord to pay for it? We run the argument. They almost never reach tribunal because it's a way on the whole negotiation happens as you get nearer a tribunal. But that's about landlord funding. But the alternative we now have is Section 19A, introduced by the Agriculture Act. And this allows an 86 Act tenant, not an FBT tenant, but an 86 Act tenant, to move to arbitration if there is an issue over a term of the tenancy agreement or of a landlord's consent so far as it relates to either a legal requirement, okay, so that could be 4 months slurry storage, but not yet 6, or for access to a financial assistance scheme, like the slurry storage grant. Now, because what we're arguing about here at this stage, pure and simple, is the tenant's ability to spend his own money on the landlord's farm. Now, Section 11 is about the landlord's money ultimately, though you may come to a deal. Here we're looking at the tenant spending his money for the viability of the business on the landlord's land. The structure of how this is laid out, and it's all written up in our publication last June on the tenancy update paper, here is very much encouraging parties to talk to each other, to lay their propositions out, to negotiate. Now, the number of these that actually reach arbitration will be quite few, but Andrew will be very pleased to appoint an arbitrator should you need one in these circumstances. But looking at the funding of all of this, is it rational? And if it is, how on earth are we going to do it? And then thinking through, and again, some security may assist the bank on the matter anyway. You've had this argument already around here, but I go back to the analogy with milk quota and the days of Sappho when that came in. That was the slurry storage. That was a frightener in many situations. And I can think of, particularly at the moment, listen to what they're saying about the pollution in Windermere. You may have some very low-intensity farms that are actually, in pollution terms, unsustainable. And you may find it's not a slurry store you need, it's a completely different business model. And looking at it then again, rethinking completely. But at that point, parties could pack up and say, okay, we're not dairying, we're not going to spend 100,000 on the slurry store, we're going to split the milk quota between us under the 86 Act, and I will go and rear heifers. And that was a different model. But of course, as I say, you need the application in for the lump sum by 30th of September this year. Your slurry store grant might not be around until the autumn, and so the merit of talking to you today is a chance to think about these things ahead so the conversations can be had. Supply chain pressure, and again alluded to this a number of times, I think this is where some of our better businesses are going to come under the most pressure for doing these things. They may not want to do anything but farm, but having some woodland on the land may be now an integral component of what you do to farm. It's not going to be a question of looking at the woodland separate and thinking, how on earth do I pay a rent for that? The woodland may be the precondition of the contract that produces the money that pays the rent. And so it's simply looking at it as a whole, as a bundle, because that's the way it will come in the marketplace. And so it's, you're going to want to see what measures suit you. I come back to looking at improving carbon in soils. That seems to be one of the great big plus items in all of this for everybody. But just take it through and how you go. And at that point, now let's just say that thanks to Mr. Morrison, I need to plant a couple of blocks of 5 acres each of woodland. Well, what's the landlord-tenant structure on that? And that's something we're trying to talk about and we'll have further at property in a couple of weeks' time. The landlord is clearly going to get some land back in woods that might be very good for the birds. It might be he doesn't want them. It might be he has an interest in where that's located. But what else? Who says the tenant's any good at planting trees and looking after them at this point? Scale, term, species, design. What are we actually after? Does this actually fit better with the landlord's management of woods, even if it remains within the tenancy for the purposes of the tenant talking to Morrison's? And the answers will differ. But it's just looking at those things for when they come up as practical issues. And then end of tenancy, and this builds on a question that came in the other day, and it seemed just useful to play with. We have a tenancy, it's probably about to be renewed. It's probably about to be renewed for 15 years. The landlord is tolerant of the tenant planting trees at this point. So the tenant plants trees. He does so with the benefit of the woodlands creation offer system. And the tenancy lasts 15 years. The tenant also has consent to enter the woodland carbon guarantee scheme. Let's just say the tenant renews, he gets his 15 years, and then it all ends. Where are we at that point? Well, the trees are almost certainly under any kind of conception and improvement. They've added a value, there's timber there and one thing and another. Looking at this as an FBT, but the scale of grant now available under UCO is so great that there might not be that much compensation really to be paid. So that might be a bit of a lemon. The Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme agreement, if it's all properly dealt with in the paperwork, could be one of your first experiences of looking at an intangible advantage as an improvement under an FBT. That's a right to an income stream. If the landlord picks that up, he's picking it up when the trees have done their little bit of adolescence. They've gone from transplant to whip and getting better, they're getting to them at the point when they might start putting some carbon on. There might actually be some payments at that stage. And that might well be something that you would have to value and look at as an intangible advantage, as an improvement under an FBT. But as I said, the trees, probably the scale of UCO grant may mean there's not much to be paid for. Playing that through with an AHA, well, we are allowed trees under the AHA. Value added to the holding is a holding, unless, of course, you agreed otherwise, and probably all the agreements you thought about for sheds you'd forgotten to think about in terms of trees. So it probably is the value you've added to a holding, and you get on and deal with it, but you are supposed to take grant into account. The Woodland Carbon Guarantee Scheme, unless you've agreed anything contractually, isn't recognised by the 86 Act. That's why intangible advantages were there in 95, because in dealing with the 95 legislation, it was foreseeable that pieces of paper and permissions and the like would become more valuable than concrete over the lifetime of the FBT system. I'm suggesting that that might now be on the edge of happening. So we've got more flexibility to handle new economic activity. FBTs, of course, must start primarily agricultural. AHAs, likewise. There's more latitude, more of a framework in law for handling greater diversification of FBTs. Just means you can't relet it if you really fundamentally, massively diversify one. It then would have to be a 54 Act tenancy at that stage. So worth being careful, but actually both structures will take a lot of additional diversified activity around a continuing exercise. If you want the horror story, and actually if you really want a very, very entertaining case, if you've got an hour and a half to read the 94 pages of judgment, go to Fife and Esselmont, the Scottish Land Court case under Section 1 of the Scottish Agricultural Holdings Act, which just looks like Section 1 of the English Agricultural Holdings Act. So at this point it works across the Great Britain. He's a double glazing salesman, was Mr. Esselmont, and he diversified into conservatories. But he happened to be an AHA tenant. AHA tenancy was a very good place to park a lot of double glazing. And he did make some desultory arrangements in the farming that he'd lost interest in, whereby a man notionally called a contractor turned up, planted some barley seed and went away with the barley crop and never really paid for anything, and ditto around some grazing. And when it came to it, the test that Mr. Esselmont failed, even with the Scottish Land Court with all its prejudices, was that he was not using himself, the tenant, that land for agriculture in his trade or business, even if the trade or business was double glazing selling, which wouldn't matter. He just wasn't using the land for agriculture himself in that business. Other people happen to be let on like gypsies. So he lost his tenancy. He blew one of the most secure sets of legal rights he could possibly have at this point. So watch that area if you're acting for a tenant. And at some point in all of this, of course, you may anyway want to adapt the structure. You know, the people who let the pig farm on a 20-year FBT and let the AD unit on a 54 Act tenancy, that happens sometimes. Might be a right answer in some cases, might be the wrong answer in others. But looking at these things as you come through. So just to play with peat as an extreme test of Section 19A at this point. There's some quite significant sums of money possibly going to float around on peat, because peat's a really big nightmare for government. It oozes carbon everywhere. About 4% of the national greenhouse gas emissions come off peat. So you're confronted, let us say hypothetically, as landlord and tenant, with an exceptionally generous peatland restoration scheme. Re-wetting all that peat could actually mean that it's not usable for agriculture, and you can't think how on earth it's a business, unless you can find some means of harvesting sphagnum moss. But the money's hellish attractive, let's just say. And that's the point, whether using Section 19A or otherwise, all the injunctions to do as little damage as possible suddenly get thrown out of the window. You might start thinking about a completely radical rewriting of the agreement between the two parties if it unlocks that load of value. But again, right terms, right price in all of this. So looking at issues commercially, not labels, analyse the deal. Work it through, test things against risk. Can the tenant deliver on the project? Does this suit the landlord's longer-term plans? What are the commitments actually being made? And you see those carbon warnings earlier. Does the use meet the tests for APR and BPR? Quite often they will. Don't assume that automatically anything that smells environmental is wrong for APR and BPR. They could be good businesses, and it could be agricultural use of agricultural property. What happens when the tenancy ends, the rent, the maintenance, the obligations, the right tenancy structure? Swift note on succession. Remember, two major changes to 86 Act succession coming through in September 2024, it's getting closer. Commercial unit test goes, end of that test, large swathe of the 86 Act dies, but a new, more demanding suitability test comes in. And so, if you like, that's the real test of is the successor up to modern expectations of management. Dispute resolution, of course, this evolution whereby Andrew now has statutory status. I greet you, I introduce you to a professional authority. And arbitrators get appointed. And this is where we've done a lot of work around this, all for other time. But just to remind you, Lady Day enders of tenancy, Lady Day arbitration appointments, roll up, we'll do them for you. And we have an oversight board with Lord Curry helping look over all of this, but looking to take this wider than tenancy arbitrations into other areas, partnerships, contracts, and so on, mediation, expert determination. And of course, all the work in being an expert witness as well as one of the building bricks of this system. Just moving on swiftly, contract farming agreements. They just need, at the moment, they need even more care probably than tenancies. Yeah, I'm a bit daunted by the notion of trying to prepare a budget for a tender for a tenancy at the moment. I am looking at people who are looking hard at the renewal of contract farming agreements. Well, the contractor will have his rates to think about. How are you going to handle the price of diesel? And people talk about escalator clauses, as they used to have for the price of diesel in operations, because that's obviously going to be one of the regulators. But I actually want to look slightly more deeper in this, and you'll see I've highlighted two things on this. A farmer and a contractor are in a mutually beneficial arrangement, if this is a good thing. That's the idea. A good contractor has got better machinery, better labour, more management skills, more timeliness and more competence than probably your farmer has, and more interest in the farmer's off doing something useful like being a stockbroker. So at that point, the contractor is bringing value that the farmer doesn't have. The risk is that would-be contractors are just as over-optimistic and enthusiastic as many would-be tenants. Only would-be tenants get mocked more for it. And they actually volunteer, they assume a world without risk. They assume that everybody's going to work as much as it possibly can, and also they want to outbid the brother-in-law. And they transfer value to the farmer. And I just want I want people in this world of so much uncertainty, so much challenge, all the moving pieces moving faster than we've ever seen before, just to think through what some of these things involve. And if we want two people to stay talking to each other sensibly across a commercial proposition between them, actually how we handle all of this and how we actually have the sensible pragmatic discussions between them. So is the first charge pitched realistically? In the work we've done on contract farming, we look and say, we saw that if the farmer is over-optimistic on the first charge, that squeezes the divisible surplus, so the contractor's going to want to charge more for his services to get his profit out of this. The lower the first charge, the more the farmer's exposed to risk, the more he's got a defensible business against the revenue, and the contractor can then be more cost neutral in terms of how he prices his services, because there's more hope of profit out of the divisible surplus. Water finds its balance in these things, but these days I think really it's stress testing. And the classic question in all these kinds of joint ventures is how you split losses. And I think thinking this through, we need to think a bit harder than we've been used to doing, because we are now, we can't see the edges at this point, and it's just feeling our way through. So much is going to turn on the quality of the relationship between the people when the world produces a surprise that they'd not ever foreseen. And that just works through in share farming and so forth. It's pragmatic review. Holding people to deals that prove to be a straitjacket is probably not intelligent if you want to deal with them next year. Now, different people have different outlooks on all of this, but too rigid a stance may break a relationship or a business. So swiftly into tax, having done you the update. Well, we now have the spring statement. It's come up. Now we've got there. And all of that we've dealt with. Making tax digital is coming down the railroads to frighten a farm near you. Watch it for multiple trades. So you are running holiday lets, you are running a contracting business, you are running a farm. I've promptly now got you to 15 making tax digital returns a year. So just watch this one. I don't think the world has really bottomed out quite the risks. And also watch this one, whether you're doing stock taking or indeed your own professional practices, that they're moving the year on which you're taxed to be the tax year, not your last accounting year that ended in the tax year. And arable farms may often be on September 30th. So does that require two stock takings? Does it require an adjustment of September 30th accounts? Does it require changing the accounting year to suit this? But quite a lot of beef farmers turn out, like lawyers, to have years that end on 30th April, because that was the date that pushed the tax payment off by the greatest number of months that was feasible. Yeah, there are a lot out there. They turned up to everybody's surprise when you start exploring this one. So people are going to have to think about that, and that's for some professional practices as much as for many farmers. Stock taking, where it's done, is an accumulation of costs. So look at where we are with prices this year. You bought your diesel back in the summer, so okay, the autumn costings are all in at 65 pence a litre, pretty much as per our costings of operations. Spring's coming up, you've had to go out and buy some. Well, you didn't quite pay at 150, but you did manage to do a good deal at 105. Your spring operations are going to have a different costing to your autumn operations. And we've got this very crude calculator for costings as to how it works through. We're likely, I think, with the newsletter or web note very, very soon, to bring you through some more approaches to how you might look at this in terms of indexes. And of course, where you're doing deemed costs, your stored crops are now going to look quite exciting at this point if you happen to have a 31st March year end, just as you will see with ends of tenancy and so on. Throwaway remark on a couple of cases. Bunny Hall, a listed building outside Nottingham, organised the sale of some building plots. The revenue found that was trading. The revenue, I mean, the tribunal found quite unhelpfully on a couple of points that it was trading, so income tax, not capital gains tax. And the prior disposal that was capital gains tax, they'd started work on the buildings before they got round to selling them. So they were at that point not part of the garden or grounds. So rather explosive. Slightly more predictable, Griffiths, potato cold store. So this was not a building at this stage. It was accepted as plant and machinery because it was an active part of the business. So it's plant and machinery, so it's in capital allowances, therefore better tax allowances, and came through. So the big thing I want to draw to your attention on capital taxes, contrary to virtually every known financial advisor under the sun, because they love making your fresh creep. They love telling you everything you've treasured and held dear is all at immediate risk from the greedy Chancellor down the road. The Treasury at the end of November replied to the Office of Tax Simplification. They reviewed its work. They said, "We love you dearly, Office of Tax Simplification. We value you very highly. You're terribly important. And we have absolutely no intention of doing anything whatsoever with your main recommendations on inheritance tax or capital gains tax. The government has decided not to proceed with any changes at the moment, but would bear your very valuable work in mind if we consider reform in the future." What they did do, with that enormous piece of comfort, and people who heard me on this before will know that I tend to see APR and BPR as very robust reliefs. You know, they've been around for 40 years. And I don't think there's too much appetite to tangle with them. But two quite useful changes, and we wait on the finance bill. Rollover relief extended where it's for compulsory purchase, so HS2 comes knocking your buildings down. They're looking now very positively, but we wait for the legislation, on allowing you to reinvest in new buildings rather than just in land or other property. And then tidying up something we don't have time to explain, but the mess that's around the timing rules for what used to be known as entrepreneurs' relief, and this will matter for people doing the lump sum and the rest of it. So the taxation of environmental agreements, and we are, Andrew, getting nearer to the end of this lot. Again, the theme, getting back to facts, not labels. Judging, does this qualify as agricultural land? Is it still a business? What's being supplied, if anything? And don't just jump to conclusions. Farming to produce environmental outputs is still farming. So on the income tax, if we look at the activity, and we look at something like here, I'm playing now with biodiversity net gain, the developer is going to want to make a single payment. Now, if that's for management, that's likely to be a lump sum that's drawn down over the period of the agreement in annual dollops to income tax. Costs offset as they're incurred. There may be capital allowances if their capital works. But where are you on penalties and bonuses in all of this? Is it actually what you're doing still farming? Just to think about that, it could be a different trade. Is there VAT to take into account on all of this? Better get that one right before you start with, because otherwise the Chancellor will take 20% out. And if it's a 30-year lease, which some of these agreements are on, that obviously then attracts SDLT, and the whole business that I've just talked about is somebody else's problem at that stage. You're just taking a rent. Now we look at the land. Have we changed its value? There's going to be an interesting case, I think, around some of these things. So let's stray away from the magic world of peat and go and look up at Glendy, some of these Scottish hill deals that are going on. Scottish hill land, where it's suitable for forestry, has gone up in value by about 2/3 in the last 2 years. How much of that is agricultural value when it comes to inheritance tax? Untested as yet. Watch where you are on some of these operations where you might be. Do you still have a farmhouse if this is really seriously environmental uses? So again, mostly it's going to be used for the purpose of agriculture, but somewhere out there is a larger margin. Is the use an active business? Coming back to this wretched peat I keep talking about, is that scheme that just to have peat wet and sodden lying on a hillside just an investment activity? What's active about it as a business? So playing with that. And tests are harsher, of course, for capital gains tax. And, of course, if you let the land to the Environment Bank for them to do things on, then that's an investment asset in anyway. And we come to the magic world of rewilding. This is one more of these absurd terms. You will tell they're absurd terms because they're in quotation marks. Shades of meaning. And we'll play with this one through. So, utterly hypothetically and completely rounded, we have an estate of 5,000 acres. It's very extensively grazed by a limited number of large agricultural mammals. This is part of Paleolithic fauna. No longer arable, so areas are reverting to scrub, but large agricultural mammals are keeping other bits down and generally keeping it in something resembling an open mosaic. There is strong nature recovery. They have serviced glamping and safaris. That's business activity. The meat is sold at premium prices from these large agricultural mammals. Brontosaurus steaks go down very well in the Islington market. And the former farm buildings are now quality office commercial lettings. So that's a hypothesis. Well, where are we on APR in this entirely hypothetical exercise? Actually, quite a lot of the land's still going to be pasture. It's going to be grazed by large agricultural mammals. The glamping site will not be APR. Really, with a handful of large agricultural mammals, can there be a farmhouse? Well, probably not, particularly if it's a castle. BPR. Well, actually, probably, on the picture I painted for you, virtually all the land's in business. You were selling safaris trotting around this lot. Much of it's in agricultural business anyway. Nature tourism, the glamping. We're piling up some of this. The glamping's an interesting case. It would count as business for income tax and capital gains tax, but we know from furnished holiday letting cases that unless we're doing an awful lot of servicing in it, it probably doesn't count for business property relief. So that's the wrong side of the equation. I think the little nightmare, though, is those converted offices that were the farm buildings employing 200 people. Does their economic activity outweigh the remaining 5,000 acres? Well, we'd have to go and look, wouldn't we? So we have through this, and we go through that, and we look at the sorts of exercise on that one to go through. Very simply, a quick warning on holiday lets in a more mundane environment on your farm and estate. And the first bit here is that this is under horrible pressure, and this will pick up on themes that Rebecca may go into in a moment. It picks up on one or two themes, and you've already heard about the pressure on this. But somewhere around about half a dozen years ago, the Treasury decided that buy-to-let was no longer a positively virtuous part of a flexible economy and made houses available for people to go and work wherever they were. It was now a fundamental vice and a maldirection of investment. And so we piled on the lost relief from mortgage interest. We whacked on a higher rate of capital gains tax. We've got case law anyway being very rude about furnished holiday lettings from business property relief. You've got 3% now additional dwelling supplement, and just be pleased you aren't in Scotland or Wales. We've got all the other pressures of being a landlord, regulations, minimum energy efficiency standards and the rest. And the net result is that having doubled the sector in the last decade, we've lost 250,000 units from the private let sector in the last 2 years. It's shrinking, and that again brings pressures because quite a lot of it's gone into holiday lets. Try being a nurse in Truro and find rented accommodation. And this is leading to the pressure that we're looking at here. And what it then added, put a lot of salt into some wounds, particularly in certain very Welsh-speaking parts of Wales, was that if a holiday let counts for business rates, it then counts often for small business rates relief, so they don't pay council tax. And at the beginning of the pandemic, they all got £10,000 as well. Went down really rather badly in certain quarters. So we have a number of issues coming through about rural communities and so on. And we're watching these areas of policy discussion now very much come to the fore. Rating against council tax, regulation, stamp duty land tax, planning. And we're seeing a block of reactions across Great Britain because this is pretty much coming through in various ways in various places. We're seeing neighbourhood plans in the southwest limiting new houses to primary occupation. May mean they don't get any new houses. East Suffolk is looking at saying, well, you're a business, aren't you, if you're a holiday let? So we'll come and inspect your kitchen. You don't get residence parking. You'll have to pay to have your waste removed. Scotland is now licensing all short let accommodation. And there's a debate in Westminster Hall in London now, today, about an equivalent system in this country, though, of course, I doubt ministers are going to pick that one up too quickly. And it's also allowing local control areas because parties who go to do Airbnb in Edinburgh apparently behave very, very badly and behave very, very noisily and upset their neighbours. So you can now in Edinburgh impose an area in which you require planning permission to move into a short let use. What we've done in England, and this now applies from April 23, but it's the facts from April 22 now matter, is that if the owner of a holiday let is to show the Valuation Office agency that it will in the coming year be available for at least 140 days. It was available for 140 days in the last year, and that last year, of course, for 23 is the year we're just entering. So you're already writing the rules for this year. And also was actually let for a genuine 70 on commercial terms. So watch that one because your first year, if you start a holiday let in 23, it'll be liable to council tax in the first year. And then it will. And then if you pass these tests, it will go through. All the pressures here are to drive holiday lets in. Do them properly, do them well, treat them as a business, and again, maximise what you can do with it. Dabbling is being hit by the tax system, and potentially where you go with the planning system. We're seeing real pressure and lots of consultations in Wales. Second homes now can pay 4 times the council tax if the local council chooses. That's just come through. We're looking at use classes to challenge the way in which planning works, and then that can affect whether there's then an extra rate of additional dwelling supplement for LTT, all under discussion, consultation response to go in. So it's got to be a proper business. Watch these planning controls. And there's actually a little bit of a theme in this that Andrew and I have mused about, which is it's possibly worth in some situations where you've got estates with a lot of holiday cottages or whatever, just doing a bit of a review and seeing, well, actually, if this lot's coming down the tracks at us, this lot's going to protect good existing holiday lets because it's going to shut off the competition. It'll narrow the base, so probably allow you to charge more. So do it well, but thinking through where you might be so you are ready for the direction of travel, rather than, again, as elsewhere, finding it happen to you. So there you are, tenancies and tax. We finally finish on very, very short tenancies. But there's work in that too. And Rebecca will now take you into the murkier world where we really are heading in England on residential tenancies.
Thank you as ever, Jeremy. If you thought Jeremy had a lot to tell you in the first hour this morning, if you do have to leave us, could you please leave your badges on the reception desk? Thank you. Yeah, there she is. There she is. So yes, plenty more to think about and plenty more to do. So thank you very much, Jeremy. So our final session is from Rebecca again. And Rebecca, you're going to kindly give us an update on residential tenancies. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I am. And final session for today now. So on to more familiar territory of residential tenancies for many of you. Apologies, it just takes a second to share my screen. Which I hope is now up. So I'm going to do a very quick recap at some of the recent changes that some of you will have seen and a bit of a reminder about what those are and some queries that we're receiving at Central. And then we're going to look at an interesting case regarding the execution of documents on behalf of a limited company. If you do act for a limited company, either landlord or tenant, this will be of interest to you. And a little bit of a glimpse, and Jeremy's touched on some of this already, about what's coming for the private rented sector, so what to look out for. So some recent changes then. Again, so much has happened over the last couple of months that this already feels ages ago as well. But you're now back into what I would call the old normal in terms of regaining possession with 2 months' notice now. That's been the case since the beginning of October last year. Not so recent, and this has been out for a while now, is the new electrical safety standards applying in England, which apply to all new tenancies from July 2020 and existing ones from April last year. We still get quite a lot of queries on this, actually, with confusion, particularly over farmhouses or dwellings that are in sort of farm lettings, like part of an AHA or an FBT. So just as a very quick reminder, the electrical safety standards do apply to tenancies where it's somebody's primary or main residence, where a rent is paid, but it does exclude tenancies that are for a term of 7 years or more. So that would potentially bring in some agricultural tenancies or farm cottages that are let out. And just to sort of signpost you, really, there's obviously government guidance on this, but I will also just mention there's a very good podcast. My predecessor, Kate, I know she's in the audience today, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, it's a very good podcast on this subject, as well as some comprehensive notes. So please do go and take a look if you have any queries. And if you're still not sure, by all means, get in touch. Okay, some other recent changes then, again, relating to the UK leaving the EU. The new right to rent checks came in from the 1st of July last year for EEA and Swiss citizens. Many will have applied for the EU settlement scheme and would have received the certificate of application. So if you have one of those tenants then and you act for a landlord, you'll need to check the Home Office regarding their status. And for biometric card holders, up until the 5th of April this year, it's still allowed for you to carry out manual checks of those cards. But from the 6th of April, so not too distant future now, you will have to check them on the Home Office online service only. And updated guidance has been issued, and there's a link in the presentation to that. Sorry, excuse me. The COVID's coming back in the afternoon. Okay. A quick look now at this case regarding signing on behalf of a corporate landlord. This is an appeal. The original case was heard in the High Court early last year, so just over 12 months ago. Most recently, we've had the Court of Appeal decision. So Northwood Sullyhole Limited, they were a corporate landlord, and their tenant, Fern & Cook, essentially fell into rent arrears. I think they owed over £3,000 at the time. So the landlord served a notice to quit, issuing proceedings on grounds 8, etc. of the Housing Act 1988. Now, the tenant raised a dispute regarding the validity of notices, and they raised two disputes, really. One was regarding the confirmatory certificate relating to the protection of deposit, and then also they questioned the validity of the Section 8 notice, sort of presenting the same argument, really, for both. So the Court of Appeal looked at both of these matters, first of all, by looking to see what the statute actually says. So for the confirmatory certificate for the deposit, the Housing Act says that prescribed information should be provided to the tenant. And of course, then you have the statutory instrument that says that what that should be, which essentially is a form of a certificate signed by the landlord, that's highlighted there, and that the information is accurate to the best of the knowledge, etc. However, the argument that the tenant sort of put forward and submitted was that Section 44 of the Companies Act requires that either two directors sign a document, or that one director signs with a witness. So let's have a look. This is what it looks like. You can see there, on the highlighted section, that only one director signed, so Miss A. Brown signed. So what the tenant was saying is this didn't sit with Section 44 of the Companies Act. For the Section 8 notice, again, and we'll come to the decision in a moment, but so Section 8 notice, again, the Court of Appeal looked at what the statute said. The Housing Act 1988 says it doesn't require a signature at all. It just requires service by the landlord in a prescribed form. And again, that's the prescribed form, that's a statutory instrument there. With, again, the tenant making the same argument regarding the Companies Act. And this is what the Section 8 notice looked like. So you can see where the signature is. So Miss Miles, she was an authorised agent, so she was authorised to act on behalf of the landlord. But at the bottom of the notice, on the rubric, she crossed through everything else, just leaving landlord. And again, the tenant said that this was not valid because it should be signed by the limited company. So the initial High Court decision last year agreed with the tenant regarding the confirmation certificate for the deposit, with the landlord due to pay a penalty to the tenant. But they held that the Section 8 notice was actually valid and that it was simply a warning notice that the landlord is considering proceedings. The Court of Appeal decision of this year actually disagreed with the High Court's decision regarding the confirmation certificate, and essentially said that, if you remember, only one of the directors had signed here, but the quote is there, and essentially they say that it couldn't sensibly be understood that she was a company. You know, a company is a separate legal identity, but the company can't sign for itself, and therefore it relies upon its sort of servants and agents to sign on its behalf. And essentially, a sensible person receiving that certificate would have sort of ignored any obvious errors. And helpfully, they upheld the Section 8 notice, the decision of the High Court of the Section 8 notice, confirming that that was also valid. So in both instances, actually, the Court of Appeal made it quite a real-world decision, which is helpful for agents acting for landlords. You can indeed sign something on behalf of a corporate landlord. However, you know, to avoid sort of expensive litigation, it would be helpful to avoid any disputes and ensure that anything you cross out at the bottom makes it clear that you're signing on behalf of a landlord. Okay, so let's have a little look at what's coming now for the private rented sector and what to look out for. The Levelling Up white paper had several things in there that was mentioned, one of which was the Decent Homes Standards. And we're yet to see the details of this, but the aspiration that's mentioned in the paper is that the number of non-decent rented homes will have fallen by 50% by 2030. There's due to be a consultation on that and more detail to follow, which we're keeping an eye on. This isn't new news, but it's been again reconfirmed that Section 21 no-fault notices will be abolished. Ourselves at CAAV, we have had already a meeting with the government about this, with DLUC, and where we've raised several concerns. We're not alone in raising the issues regarding Section 8 grounds and the practicalities and issues with regaining possession, with having to apply for court possession. So that is something that they are looking at, and we're waiting to hear from them further. Something else that's been mentioned is a new National Landlords Register, for that to play a role in sort of taking action against rogue landlords. Some other things that have been going on fairly recently, there was a consultation that closed earlier this year regarding the phasing out of fossil fuels in properties that are off the gas grid. And what that essentially, and that's not just the rented sector, that's all homes that have fossil fuel heating. So if you have properties on estates that you manage that have, say, got an oil-fired boiler, the proposal is that when that goes bang and stops working, from a certain date, you will not be able to replace it with another all-fired boiler, with the preference being the government's strategy here is for a heat pump first approach. Now, that brings around several practical issues, not one of which links back to my comments earlier about the grid capacity, with an uptake of people wanting to install, if they do want to install even, a heat pump, that will place significant demand on the existing grid, as well as other complications with retrofitting something of that nature, particularly in traditional buildings. So we're awaiting a government response on that and watching that one quite closely. There was 2 consultations actually regarding this that ran in tandem. One was for residential and the other one was for non-domestic property, with, again, very similar in terms of their proposals. A consultation which is almost sort of forgotten about now, but we got carried almost over 12 months ago. The consultation closed over 12 months ago, was the proposal to increase the minimum energy efficiency standards of dwellings in the rent sector to be Band C. And the proposal was that that would be for new tenancies from 2025 and existing tenancies from 2028. Now, we're still awaiting a government response on that. I did attend a meeting with DLUC last week regarding their non-domestic consultation. And they indicated that a government response on the residential side should be coming out soon. So I'm keeping a close eye on that. And then in the background, there's grants now available for under the Boiler Upgrade Scheme for things like your air source heat pumps. So that is now available, as well as others coming forward. And essentially what we're expecting is an awful lot of the proposals, including the Decent Home Standards and the National Landlords Register. We're expecting quite a lot of that to be in a future white paper on the private rented sector, with lots of consultations. I suspect we'll dip it up around about now. I haven't seen anything as of yet, but it is something that we're watching and we'll be engaging with you on and asking for your views as well as those roll out. So I think I've managed to bring us back, well, slightly early, actually, on time, Andrew. So if I can hand back for you for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm just going to move temporarily. Right. Questions and close, it says on here. So are there any questions from the floor, please, for either Jeremy on his 2 papers or from... for Rebecca in terms of the residential update? So any questions from the floor, please?
We've got an hour and a half till 6 o'clock in Sainsbury's.
I think you've told them all they need to know, or all they can cope with at this stage of the afternoon. Right, well, in which case I won't delay you from your decision about Sainsbury's very much longer. I hope, I've heard this a number of times, and I still find it as interesting as the first time I heard it, because there is just so much subject matter that today has addressed that I'm sure you'll all go away and absorb and reflect and think. But just in pulling a few thoughts together and a few key phrases from the day, a generation's change in a decade, undoubtedly. Look behind the label. That's what we should do all the time. Manage change before it manages you. That's what our clients want from us. Right terms, right price. We're all negotiators. And if you haven't listened to it, listen to the latest podcast that went online this week on that very matter, because I listened to it yesterday morning and I think it's one of the better ones personally. That's not criticising the others. It's just because I think it's very, very good, and it's well worth a listen. And it addresses a lot of issues about behaviours in negotiation, which is, as many of you who know me, is a major hang-up of mine. Take the holistic view. We are the trusted advisor. And our clients should and do value our opinion. If there aren't opportunities for us as a profession at this moment in time, then I don't know when there will ever be so. So take what you've learned from today, turn those into opportunities, turn that into advice, and turn that as your contribution into how we manage that generational change in a decade. Thank you very much for your attendance and your attention. Have a safe journey home. And please, as I was saying a minute ago, when you do leave, just on a matter of housekeeping for those in the room, can you please leave your badges in the box on the reception desk, because we will recycle for Cheltenham in 2 weeks' time. Thank you very much, and goodbye.